The morning the car exploded, Ana Reyes had already noticed 3 things wrong with the world. The first was the coffee. Rafael Costa took his black, no sugar, in the same white cup every morning at 6:15, and the new kitchen girl had brought it at 6:20 in the wrong cup. Small. Forgettable. Ana forgot nothing. The second was the dog. The Doberman that patrolled the East Garden, the one that hated strangers with a religious devotion, hadn't barked once since 4 in the morning. A silent guard dog was not a resting guard dog. It was a bribed one, or a dead one. The third was the driver. She saw him through the tall, arched windows of the villa's marble foyer as she moved through her rounds, a dust cloth folded over one arm, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the stone. He stood beside the black limousine in the courtyard, adjusting his cuffs, and he was wrong in every way that mattered and no way that anyone else would catch. The regular drivers stood with their weight forward, ready, scanning. This one stood with his weight back on his heels, relaxed, bored, the posture of a man who did not expect to be here long. His suit was correct, his shoes were correct, but his eyes never once swept the rooftop line, and every real man of Rafael's checked the rooftops. It was a reflex burned into them by years of enemies who liked high ground. This man didn't check the rooftops because this man wasn't afraid of what was on them. Ana felt the old, cold thing move in her chest, the thing she had spent 4 years burying under aprons and grocery lists, and the quiet rhythm of someone else's house. She had trained herself not to see the world this way anymore. She had promised the graves of her husband and her daughter that she would stop, that she would become small and silent and safe, that she would let the sharpness in her go dull. But the driver's shoes hadn't moved once, and the dog hadn't barked, and the coffee had come late. Rafael descended the grand staircase at 6:40 exactly, buttoning the jacket of a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Ana had earned in her old life in a year. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with the gym and everything to do with the war that had made him a scar-cutting pale through his left eyebrow, another vanishing beneath his collar. His face was a closed door. Los Angeles knew Rafael Costa the way it knew earthquakes. Something to be feared, respected, and never fully understood. Men went quiet when he entered rooms. Rivals had died for less than looking at him too long. To Ana, for 8 months, he had been a man who never said thank you and never once raised his voice, and who left the lights on in his study until 3 in the morning, as if sleep were an enemy he couldn't defeat. He paused at the bottom of the stairs so she could straighten his tie. It had become a ritual neither of them acknowledged. Her hands were steady as she smoothed the silk, folded his collar down, brushed a fleck of nothing from his lapel. He watched the far wall over her head the way he always did, as if her presence were beneath his notice. She lowered her voice until it was almost nothing, a breath. "Don't get in that car." His eyes came down to hers. Sharp, instant, the relaxed indifference gone as though it had never existed. "The driver isn't one of your men," she whispered. "The dog hasn't barked since 4. Something is wrong." For one long second, the whole house seemed to hold its breath. She saw him do the arithmetic behind his eyes, the coffee, the silence, 8 months of a housekeeper who noticed everything and said nothing. She saw him decide to believe her, and it cost him something she couldn't name. He took 1 step back from the door. He lifted one hand and gestured, small and final, to the man near the wall. The driver in the courtyard glanced up. Their eyes met through the glass, and the driver ran. The limousine detonated a half-second later. The blast came through the arched windows in a wall of white and orange, and the world turned to sound. Ana felt Rafael's arm close around her before she understood she was moving, felt herself pulled hard against the pillar as glass sprayed across the foyer like a thrown handful of diamonds. Heat rolled over them. Somewhere, an alarm began to scream. The great chandelier above them swung and shivered. When she opened her eyes, they were on the floor, and Rafael Costa was over her, his body a shield between hers and the burning courtyard, his hand cradling the back of her head against the stone. Smoke poured through the shattered windows. Beyond him, the limousine was a skeleton wrapped in fire, and the courtyard where the false driver had stood was empty. Rafael looked down at her, ash on his face, blood at his hairline, and in his eyes something she had not seen in 8 months of straightening his tie. She saw him see her, not the housekeeper, her. "Who are you?" he said quietly. They put out the fire before the neighbors' cameras could catch too much. Money did that. Within the hour, men in dark suits swept the villa. A doctor came and went. The story that would reach the outside world was already being written, a gas line, a tragic accident, nothing to see. Anna sat in the kitchen with a cut on her forearm and her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, and she watched Rafael's men move through the house, and she felt every one of them clock her as a problem. The one who worried her stood in the doorway of the study, giving orders, a lean, grey-templed man in his 50s with a soldier's spine and hands that were, she noticed, not quite steady. Marcus Vane, head of security. The man who had run Rafael's protection for 11 years, who vetted every driver, who assigned every shift. Who would have known, better than anyone alive, which driver was supposed to be in that courtyard this morning? He crossed the kitchen and crouched in front of her, and to her surprise, his grey eyes were gentle. "You saw it," he said, "before any of us. The boss told me what you whispered." He studied her the way a man studies a lock he can't yet pick. 8 months you've been in this house, and I never once looked at you twice. That was my mistake. A pause. You have good eyes, Miss Reyes. Where does a housekeeper get eyes like that? I clean up after careless people, Anna said, holding his gaze. You notice things. Doing that. You notice when something's out of place. Marcus smiled, and for half a second the smile reached his eyes, and she saw something behind it that she hadn't expected, not cruelty, but exhaustion. The bone-deep tiredness of a man carrying something too heavy for too long. Out of place, he repeated softly. Yes, he stood, and the tiredness folded itself away. Get some rest. You've earned it. Anna watched him walk away and thought, he doesn't know that I know. Not yet. Because Anna had been watching Marcus Vane for 6 weeks. It had started small, the way these things always did. A phone call he took in the garden, with his back to the house. The way he had begun, lately, to speak of Rafael in the past tense, when he thought no one was listening, the way the boss used to be, before he lost his edge, small tenses, small tells. The grammar of a man already mourning someone who wasn't dead yet. But it was the photograph that had first stopped her cold. 3 weeks ago, dusting the security office, she had knocked a folder from the shelf, and among the papers that spilled out was a picture 2 decades old, 2 young soldiers in a desert, arms slung across each other's shoulders, laughing at something outside the frame. One was unmistakably a younger Rafael, the other was Marcus, on the back, in faded ink, brothers to the end. And Anna, kneeling on the floor gathering papers, had felt the first thread of the thing pull loose, because a man does not keep a photograph like that unless he loves the man in it, and she had been listening to that same man rehearse a funeral for weeks. Love and betrayal, she had learned long ago, were not opposites. They lived in the same house. They often shared a bed. She had told herself it wasn't her business. She had a new life now, a quiet one. She emptied wastebaskets and pressed shirts and did not investigate anyone ever again, because the last time she had followed a thread like this, it had ended with a gang burning everything she loved to the ground to keep her quiet. But she had kept watching Marcus Vane anyway, because some things you can't stop being, no matter how deep you bury them. Rafael came to her that night. He found her in the servants' wing, in the small, clean room that held everything she owned in the world, a narrow bed, a dresser, a single photograph turned face down on the nightstand. He stood in her doorway, filling it, and for a moment neither of them spoke. My security team vetted that driver's replacement for years, he said finally. My men on the wall, my cameras, my dog, not one of them saw what a housekeeper saw before her morning coffee. He stepped into the room. So, I'll ask you again. Who are you? Anna looked at him for a long moment, at the ash still ghosting the line of his jaw, at the exhaustion he carried like a second suit, and she made a choice. She had promised 2 graves she would never make again. My name is Anna Reyes, she said. 9 years ago, I was a homicide investigator with the LAPD. I was good at it. I was good at seeing the thing that was wrong in a room full of things that were right. Her voice didn't shake. She had practiced not letting it shake for 4 years. I put away a man named Duarte. His people came to my house while I was at work. My husband and my 6-year-old daughter were home. She held his gaze. I stopped being a detective the day I buried them. I became someone no one would ever look at twice. A woman cleaning houses, invisible, safe. The silence stretched. "You could have taken any job in the city," Rafael said. "Why mine?" "Because no one comes looking for a woman in the home of a man everyone is already afraid of," she said simply. "Your house was the safest place I could disappear." He absorbed this. She watched him turn it over, testing it for lies, finding none. "And this morning?" he asked. "The driver, the dog. What made you look?" Aina hesitated. This was the edge of the cliff. On one side, silence and safety. On the other, everything. "Because I'd already started looking," she said. "Weeks ago, at something else in this house." Rafael went very still. "At what?" She met his eyes. "You're not going to want to believe me." He didn't, not at first. Marcus Vane had pulled Rafael out of a burning transport in the war 20 years ago. Marcus Vane had stood at his side through 3 Mafia wars and buried men beside him, and taken a bullet meant for his chest in a parking garage in the rain. There was no name Rafael trusted more. To accuse Marcus was to accuse his own right hand of belonging to a stranger. "You've been in this house 8 months, Rafael said coldly, and the warmth that had almost been in the room was gone. "He's been at my side for 11 years. You'll need more than a dog that didn't bark, and a feeling." "I know," Anna said quietly. "That's exactly why I haven't said a word until now, because I know what it costs to be wrong about something like this, and I know what it costs to be right." She stood. "Give me a week. Watch me the whole time if you don't trust me, but watch him too, and if I find nothing I'll leave your house and you'll never hear from me again." Rafael was silent for a long time. Then, 1 week. At the door, he stopped. Without turning, he said, "He carried me out of a fire once, when I couldn't walk. He's the reason I'm alive to be standing here." "I know," Anna said gently. "I've seen the photograph." Rafael's shoulders went rigid. He left without another word, and Anna understood that she had just asked him to hold a knife to the throat of the only brother he had left. The security office was the hardest room in the villa to get into, and Anna spent 4 nights learning it, the way she had once learned crime scenes slowly, patiently, from the edges in. The door had a keypad and a camera. She couldn't beat the keypad, but she didn't need to. She simply became, more thoroughly than ever, the invisible woman who cleaned. She brought the night guard coffee at 2 a.m. She learned that Marcus dismissed the office camera's feed to his own phone and reviewed it himself, which meant the camera was not her enemy. The schedule was. She learned that on Thursday nights Marcus left the villa for 3 hours and told the men it was to meet an informant. On the second Thursday, she followed him. Not in a car, she had no car. She followed the only way a housekeeper could. She memorized the address he gave the driver by lingering in the garage with a bag of trash, and the next morning, on her half-day, she took 3 buses to a marina in San Pedro and stood across the water with a paper cup of coffee and watched a boat she'd seen him board the week before. A man came off it, not one of Rafael's. She knew the face it had been in a briefing folder on Rafael's desk that she had glanced at while dusting. A folder marked with the name that made every man in the house lower his voice. Solano, the rival family. The one that had wanted Rafael Costa dead for a decade and never once come close. They had never come close, she thought, watching Marcus shake the hand of a Solano lieutenant on a boat in the fog, because they had never had a man on the inside. Now they did. She still had no proof. A meeting was not a crime. She needed what was in that office, and getting it meant getting in on a Thursday, in the 3 hours Marcus was gone, past a camera whose feed went to his phone. So she gave the camera something boring to watch. For a week, every night, she cleaned the hallway outside the office at exactly 9 p.m. Mopping, dusting, invisible, routine, until the sight of the housekeeper in that corridor was the most ordinary thing in the world. And on the 3rd Thursday, at 9 p.m., she cleaned her way through the door one of the guards had propped open to carry out a broken chair, and she was inside. She had 11 minutes before the guard came back. The ledger that didn't reconcile was in the 2nd drawer. The burner phone was taped beneath the 3rd, exactly where a soldier would hide something low, awkward, a place you'd have to kneel to find. Her hands remembered this. The old skills woke in them like they had never slept. She photographed the ledger. She photographed a shipping manifest for a company that didn't exist, routing money through 4 shells to an account she'd bet her life traced back to the boat in San Pedro. She thumbed the burner alive and found the folder of deleted messages that were never quite deleted enough, and there was the timeline. laid out in the flat language of a man arranging a death. The bomb was step 1. Step 2 was chaos. Rafael gone, the organization leaderless, and Marcus stepping forward as the loyal lieutenant to hold it all together while the Solanos moved in. She was 3 photos from finished when she heard the guard's footsteps in the corridor. Early. Anna did not run. She had learned, long ago, that running got you caught. She set the phone back beneath the drawer, picked up her dustcloth, and was polishing the edge of the desk when the guard put his head in. "You're not supposed to be in here," he said, frowning. "Door was open," Anna said, not looking up, wiping down the desk with the bored patience of a woman who had wiped 10,000 desks. Someone tracked ash all over the floor. "Whole house smells like smoke since the fire. You want me to leave it?" The guard looked at the ash, real ash. She'd made sure of it, and his frown eased. "No, just finish up and lock it when you go." Said Anna, and kept polishing, and did not breathe until his footsteps faded. She had the photographs. She also had, sitting cold in her stomach, the last message in the folder, the one Marcus had typed and never sent. It was to no one. A draft, saved and abandoned, dated the night before the bomb. "He was my brother. Tell yourself that's not what this is. Tell yourself he stopped being that a long time ago." Anna stood in the dark office and understood that she was not hunting a monster. She was hunting a grieving man who had talked himself into a murder and hated himself for it, and that was so much worse, because a monster you could simply stop. A grieving man you could only mourn. She meant to bring the photographs to Rafael the next morning. She never got the chance. She was crossing the darkened corridor toward the servants' wing when the lights came on, and Marcus Vane was standing at the end of it, and she knew from his face that the guard had mentioned the housekeeper in the office, and that Marcus, unlike the guard, had done the arithmetic. "You brought the boss coffee at 2 in the morning last Tuesday," he said quietly. "You cleaned the same 12 feet of hallway every night for a week, and tonight you were in a locked room with a story about ash." He shook his head slowly, and he did not reach for a weapon, and somehow that was more frightening than if he had. "I told you that you had good eyes, Miss Reyes. I should have told you that eyes like that get people killed." "They already did," Anna said. "Mine, everyone I loved." Something moved across his face. "Then you know," he said. "You know what it is to lose the thing you'd have died for, and you keep looking anyway." He almost sounded like he understood her. "He probably did. I don't want to do this." "I saw the photograph," Anna said, "in the desert. Brothers to the end." She watched him flinch and pressed into it because it was the only weapon she had. "You still keep it, Marcus. A man doesn't keep a photograph like that of someone he's stopped loving." "Don't," he said, and his voice cracked down the middle. "He pulled you out of a fire," Anna said. "No, you pulled him, and now you're going to burn him for a boat full of Solanos who'll put a bullet in you the day after they don't need you." She took a step toward him, unarmed, empty-handed, a housekeeper facing a soldier. "You know that. You wrote it down. Tell yourself that's not what this is." You couldn't even finish the sentence. Marcus Vane stared at her, and for a long, trembling moment she saw the whole war inside him, the brother and the empire, the debt and the grievance. 20 years of standing one step behind a man he loved, and had convinced himself he'd been owed the throne of. "He got soft," Marcus whispered, "and it was a plea, not an argument. He keeps a housekeeper who spies on him and calls it loyalty. He leaves his lights on all night like a frightened boy. The organization needs someone who can still make the hard." "Then make it," said Rafael Costa, from the darkness behind him. Marcus went very still. He did not turn. "How long have you been standing there?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was a man realizing the exact size of the thing he'd already lost. "Long enough," Rafael said. He stepped into the light, and there was no gun in his hand, which frightened Anna more than anything, because it meant he had come to talk to his brother and not to kill him. "San Pedro, the manifests, the boat." His voice was terribly even. I checked myself. "Tonight, I didn't want to believe her, Marcus. So I went and made sure she was wrong." A long breath. She wasn't wrong. And now Marcus turned, and Anna saw his face, and there was no villain in it at all, just a 50-year-old man with wet eyes, and a gun he had, at some point, drawn without seeming to decide to. "You were supposed to be in the car," Marcus said. His voice broke completely. "It was supposed to be over in a second. You weren't supposed to see it. I didn't want you to see it coming, Rafa. I didn't want you to know it was me. I know, Rafael said gently. I know you didn't. For one heartbeat, the gun wavered, dropped, almost toward the floor. For one heartbeat, Anna thought it might not end the way these things always ended. Then boots sounded on the marble behind them, the guard, drawn by voices, and Marcus flinched at the sound, the instinct of a cornered animal, and the gun came up again toward the man who had just called him brother. Rafael was faster. He had come unarmed, but the guard behind him had not, and Rafael had a soldier's hand on the man's weapon before Anna saw him move. 2 shots. So close they sounded like one. Marcus' Vane fell. Rafael was across the corridor and on his knees beside him before the echo died, and Anna understood, watching, that the second shot had come from Marcus, that even now, even at the end, some part of the man had not been able to aim at Rafael and had put the bullet high and wide into Rafael's side instead of his heart. The way you miss on purpose, the way you flinch away from the thing you cannot make yourself do. You missed, Rafael said, holding his brother's head off the cold floor, his own blood spreading dark across his shirt. You always were a terrible shot when it counted. Marcus almost smiled. His hand found Rafael's sleeve. The photograph, he breathed. Desk drawer. I never. And then he was gone, and Rafael Costa knelt in the dark, holding the only brother he had ever had, and did not make a sound. He didn't die. Anna wouldn't let him. The doctor money bought stitched the wound in his own bed, and in the grey hours before dawn, when the house was finally quiet and the body of Marcus Vane had been carried away with more gentleness than a traitor was owed, Anna sat beside him in the dark, because she couldn't make herself leave, and had stopped pretending she could. You should sleep, she said. I don't sleep. His voice was rough with blood loss and something underneath it. He was staring at the ceiling, and on the nightstand beside him sat the desert photograph, retrieved from the drawer, 2 young soldiers laughing at something outside the frame. Everyone I keep close dies, Anna. My brother, my real one years ago, my mentor, and now him. A long silence. I stopped letting people close a long time ago. It was safer, for them. A pause. I told myself it was for them. He didn't stop loving you, Anna said quietly. That's why he missed. Rafael's jaw worked. He didn't answer for a while. You knew, he said finally. Before I did. You knew, and you didn't come to me with it like a trophy. You made me go and see it for myself. He turned his head on the pillow to look at her. Why? Because if I'd just told you, you'd have spent the rest of your life wondering if I made it up, Anna said. You had to be the one to find him. It was the only way you'd ever believe it, and the only way you'd ever be able to trust me. Something shifted in his face. Trust, he repeated, like a word in a language he'd half forgotten. I'm not going to tell you I feel things I haven't earned the right to feel, Anna said carefully, and she was talking to herself as much as to him. I loved a man once, completely. I watched the world I used to police turn him to ash to punish me for looking too hard at it. I swore I'd never feel anything that big again, because feeling it is what got them killed. Her throat tightened. So I'm not going to sit here and say a big word to you the night you buried your brother. That's not fair to either of us. Then what will you say? Rafael asked. Anna looked at him, this frightening, broken, lonely man who had shielded her body with his own before he knew her name, who had walked unarmed toward his own murderer, because he could not bear to draw on someone he loved. I'll say I trust you, she said, which is a bigger word than the other one, for people like us. I haven't trusted anyone in 4 years, not with what I really am, and I trusted you with all of it tonight. She reached out slowly, and this time she did not stop, and her hand found his where it lay open on the blanket. That's where I start. That's all I have to give right now. Rafael looked down at their hands. For a long moment he was silent, and she thought perhaps she had said the wrong thing, offered too little. Then his fingers closed around hers, careful, certain, like a man who had learned to hold things gently because everything he'd ever gripped hard had broken. That's more than anyone's given me in 11 years, he said. Trust is enough. Trust is where I want to start too. A pause, and the ghost of something almost like a smile. The other word can wait. We'll earn it. We'll earn it, she agreed. Sleep, she said, and turned her hand in his so, their fingers laced together. I'll watch the dark for you tonight. And for the first time, in longer than he could remember, Rafael Costa closed his eyes and did. The Solano family made 2 more attempts that spring. Both times, the thing that was wrong in the room was seen before it could bloom: a florist's van that idled too long, a waiter whose hands were too steady. Both times, the woman who saw it was standing at Rafael Costa's side in the light where everyone could see her, no longer hiding, no longer invisible, her sharpness worn openly now like the weapon it had always been. They did not fall into each other all at once. People with wounds as old as theirs never do. It came slowly, in the small rituals, in the way she still straightened his tie every morning at the bottom of the grand staircase, and in the way he began, one morning, to catch her hand before she could step back and hold it a moment longer than the ritual required. In the way the study lights, which had burned until 3 in the morning for 11 years, began to go dark before midnight, because a man who has someone to watch the dark with him no longer has to fight it alone. They never spoke the big word for a long time. They didn't need to rush it. It lived, unspoken and growing, in every quiet morning, in every rooftop he now scanned out of habit he'd learned from her, in every meal she remembered exactly how he took. She had come to his house to disappear. Instead, in the home of the most dangerous man in the city, Ana Reyes had finally been found by the one man alive who understood that the sharpest eyes are the ones the world has tried hardest to blind, and who spent every day after choosing, freely and slowly and completely, to trust them with his life. On the nightstand, the desert photograph stayed where it was. Rafael never put it away. "Some things you keep," he told her once, not because they didn't end in betrayal, but because they were real before they did. And when she looked at the man beside her, she understood exactly what he meant. The end.